Hi everyone, welcome to the Paper 1 preview for 2024. This is an updated version of the video that's run a couple of times on Paper 1. So if you've watched some of those, there are some big differences in terms of what I'm talking about this time. So I'll give you a bit of a signpost to the bits that you might have already heard. Now in this video, I'm going to go through the following. I'll timestamp this in the description, so if there are certain bits you want to get to or refer back to, it'll be really easy for you to. But I'm going to go through the basics of the exam paper, what to expect. We'll talk about the exam question structure, so a little bit of exam technique. We'll talk about how to use the case study, which is really, really important for any A-level business paper, but obviously this is the first one, so this one in particular. Some tips for success, looking at a topic tracker from previous years, which questions have come up in paper 1 over the last few years, and then looking at some key links between themes 1 and 4. So we're about a week away. Well, by the time I record this, we're about a week away from the first exam, and so there'll be some more of these coming for the other papers, for paper 2 and for paper 3. Obviously, paper 3 will be a bit more specific because it has a pre-release, so we'll be talking about the clothing market in that one. But I'll aim to try and release them all at least a week in advance of the exams. If you're looking for any content revision, there's videos on the channel for those as well. I'll link those for Theme 1 and Theme 4 in the description. So I'm not going to do a huge amount of content in here, although I will do some in the links section at the end, because there's already stuff on the channel that you can use for that. So if you've got any exam-related questions, pop them in the comments for this. If you've got any content-related questions, I would advise you find the relevant video. So there's 5 videos for Theme 1 and 4 videos for Theme 4, one for each of the units. And they vary between sort of 10 and 30 minutes long. So if you're looking for a bit of a recap on any of the content, have a look at those. Those will be linked at the end of this video and in the description. So Paper 1 basics, this is what to expect. Paper 1 and Paper 2 are the same in terms of structure, in that they have 2 hours, 100 marks. That's the case for all 3 A-level papers. But the key thing with Section A and in Section B in Paper 1 and Paper 2 is that you've got 4 markers, 10 markers, 12 markers, and 20 markers. So Section A and Section B are exactly the same, 4, 4, 10, 12, 20, 4, 4, 10, 12, 20. Logic would suggest that because there's 2 sections in 2 hours, you want to try and do each section in 1 hour. Try and think of it as 2 separate papers. That would be my advice. And if you roughly spend 1 mark per minute, that's 50 marks in each section, 100 marks over 2 hours. Should give you about 10 minutes spare. You're probably going to need that for using the case study. We're going to talk about how to use the case study and how to attack the case study in a minute. But also on the 10 and 12 markers, which I think timing-wise are the trickiest bits on this paper. I think the 20 markers are pretty straightforward timing-wise, and the 4 markers should be as well. You get given a set of extracts for each section. What this means is I wouldn't jump between sections. I would do all of Section A and then all of Section B. I have no real issue with you starting with the 20 marker. That's absolutely fine. But again, as long as you've got your timing right, like you've just got to make sure you get your timing right, so because you don't want to miss out a 4 marker, especially if it could be 4 easy marks. But the key thing is, what I wouldn't advise doing the first 20 marker and then the second 20 marker, because then you're jumping from sections A to section B. And I would advise trying to have a look at how you approach the case study. For one section, do all of that section within the hour or a little bit more if you've got extra time, and then move straight onto the second section. It makes it easier for you to know exactly whether you're on time, because 1 hour into the exam or halfway into the exam, you should be exactly halfway through the paper, or hopefully maybe you've got a couple of minutes ahead of time. How you approach the case study will vary. Some students read the whole thing first. Some prefer to identify which questions are likely to be linked to each section of the case study. That's the method I would suggest. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. But first, let's talk about how you should structure your answers. 4-mark questions. Point, effect, apply times 2. For constructs, you just need to draw the graph. If it's a supply-demand curve, could be on this paper. Supply and demand curves come up in Theme 1, and this is a Theme 1 paper, Theme 1 and 4. Could be a calculation question, in which case I would make sure you're looking at the units in the question, like checking whether it's 2 decimal places, whether it's a percentage, whether it's a ratio. Wouldn't be a ratio on paper 1 actually, and making sure you're showing you're working. For 10 and 12 markers, my advice would be do the same structure. You can do 2 paragraphs for a 12 marker. In my personal opinion, unless you've got the spare time to do that, it's not worth the extra paragraph. So you want to maybe put a definition in, optional. It's only going to get you knowledge marks, but it doesn't hurt to have a definition, especially if it helps you get your sort of mindset on what you need to be answering. Do 1 each paragraph with your however being the balance. and then having a conclusion. An AGIM conclusion would be what I would recommend using. So an AGIM conclusion is answer, make your answer clear, justify, it depends on point, and then most important point. And we can talk about how we should structure our conclusions a little bit later on. Make sure your answers have balance. So for example, like positive should be however negative. Like if it's an impact question, assess the impact, do positive however negative impact. If it's assess the importance, do is important however is not important. For a 20 marker, these are the ones where you've got two different options. So you would do definitions optionally if you want to. Then your peach paragraph should be, paragraph 1 should be peach for and against option 1. Remember, we're talking about option 1 only here, not option 2. Then we do another paragraph for option 2, for and against, and then in our conclusion, we'd make our decision. Now, there's usually a hook in the questions. There's usually something else, like, is there a focus for the business in the question? Is it about increasing profit? Is it about increasing their market share? In which case, make sure your answer links to that. So let's talk about conclusions then. I mentioned AGIM, and I don't think that's been in any of my other videos so far, so it's worth just briefly going over AGIM. This is what we do with conclusions. Answer, make your choice really, really clear. Justify what's the main reason for your decision. It depends on is if you've got a negative that you offered, like a negative impact, is there anything you can do to mitigate that? And then most important point, like think about the MOPS of the business. So what does MOPS mean? MOPS means market objectives, product, service, and situation. Well, certainly that's how I use it. And what it's referring to is it's just getting you to think about the business more holistically than just what's in that question. So in your most important point, and potentially you could use this in your circumstance, part of your peach paragraphs or throughout your answer, really, never hurts to put this stuff in. Think about the following, and you wouldn't do all 4 of these, you definitely wouldn't do all 4 of these, but you might have 1 or 2 that you think are relevant, and just for one sentence, bring in these links that can show a real understanding of what the business is trying to do. So market, what do we know about the market? What competitors do they have? Is the market growing? Is it shrinking? Is it under threat? You can think about all sorts of things in here. Porter's 5 forces, there's a wide range of different parts you can use. Objectives, what's the business trying to achieve? Is it trying to be the market leader? Is it trying to survive? Is it trying to maximize profits? Thinking about does your answer link to the objective of the business? Is the product a high quality or low cost product? Is it in a mass market or a niche market? Is there something you know about the product or service that might help you make a decision or think about why the decision you've made is the right one? And then situation. Is there anything significant in the case study that's happened that you think might be important? Do they have cash problems? Do they have new leadership? Is there a new CEO there? That can quite often have a massive impact on the business. So it's just thinking about whether there's anything in the MOPS of the business that might be able to add to your answer. Okay, so theme 1, exam content, and theme 4, exam content. Goes without saying, by this point, you should know that theme 1 and theme 4 make up paper 1, theme 2 and 3 make up paper 2, and then paper 3 is a free-for-all. So you need to have an understanding of these areas. Now, for these, there's revision videos for all of these units, so I'm not going to go through this stuff now. What I'm instead going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about case study stuff and then go through some of the links between the different sets of content. So let's talk about attacking the case studies. So what I've got here is some screenshots from a walkthrough mock I did with some of my students just a couple of weeks ago. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to annotate for purpose. One of the things I hate the most when I see it in an exam paper is when a student has just got loads of highlighting and loads of underlining, but there's no real clear suggestion of what they've done that for. They've just highlighted for the sake of highlighting because they think highlighting makes a case study, makes it look like you've read something properly. What I want to see is I want to see students annotating for purpose. And so you can see with this, the first thing I've done, and I've done this here because like in the exam, you wouldn't necessarily need to do this because the extract booklet is separate, but for the benefit of just making this clear, I've written down what the 5 questions are on this section of this paper was. And then I've highlighted the case study in different colors to make it clear which bits of the case study are for which questions. Now, the purpose here is, we talked at the start about you've got 1 hour for each section. And if you know you're going to get your timing right on your questions, doing a little bit of extra time on the case study can save you time later on, because it means you won't have to flick back through and read the case study again and again and again. You can just look for certain parts. So I've highlighted the 2 4 markers in black. I've got the 10 marker in red, the 12 marker in blue, and then the 20 marker in green. And if you look through this case study, and I'm not going to read through the entire thing, but I've highlighted the bits in particular that I think are linked to that question. So, for example, and not just using the colors, but sometimes a little bit more detail to that. So, for example, I've mentioned that Ansop's matrix is the question for the 20 marker on this one. It was about existing market with new products, so market penetration, product development, and I've highlighted the examples of that in the case study, so I know which bit is for which option. For the market development bits, I've highlighted which bits are clearly for the market development. So the market development is about moving into Asia. Well, to be honest, Extract C is pretty straightforward for that, but I've highlighted specific points. I've also highlighted, you'll see there in the end of that first paragraph, a however for market development, because I thought there was a point in there that I thought was actually one of the howevers. So the point here is that when I then come to, what you've got to understand is when you're doing an exam paper, you're going to read the case study at the start of an hour, and you're going to be coming to the 20 marker, potentially 40 minutes later. And so if you're expecting to remember every single word of the case study so you can use it all, well, if you remember all of that, you've got a better memory than me. And so what I'm trying to do is make it easier for you to do that by highlighting it in a way that means you can just go back to those annotations to make the application easier. Now, this is really, really, really important because your application is in every single question. You need to get your application to get good marks. So I've got some little tips for success. I'm going to base it around this little acronym that one of my students helped me figure out a few years ago. And he said that I basically just wrote up on the board, I wrote up like 5 bullet points that I thought were really important. And I said to them, I was like, it's a shame that there's not like a word we can use to remember this, like peach, for example. And he pointed out that actually you could get rid of one of them, which combines into one of the others and pretty much just have task. So the key thing here is know your task when you're doing an exam. Every single question that you answer well will be because you've done all 4 of these things right. Every single answer that you answer poorly is because one or more of these things isn't right. So these are the key tips for success. Make sure you know your timing. Make sure you get your timing right. Practice your timing. Make sure you can answer a 10 marker in about 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Make sure you can do a 12 marker in 12 to 15 minutes. Make sure you can do a 20 marker in 20 minutes. If you miss out on your timing, it potentially stops you from answering a question later on in the paper or finishing a question. So make sure you get your timing right. I've just touched on application. You need to use the case study in every answer, so make sure you get your application right. Structure. I've talked about structure already. Do you know when you need a conclusion? Do you know how to get a balanced argument for an importance question? It is important, it isn't important. It is valuable, it isn't valuable. And then the last one is all about your knowledge. And so, do you know your key terms? I've got obviously revision videos for all of this unit in the description. I've also put a link to Theme 1 and Theme 4 Quizlet on there as well. Obviously, it's worth saying that if you don't know what a key term is and it comes up in a question, it's not hard. It's not going to be easy. You're not going to have a good time. And so making sure you know your key terms is really important as well. So if you get those 4 things right, you will do really, really well. That's pretty much guaranteed. If you get an answer that hasn't been answered very well, it's because of one of these 4 things. So if you know what your task is before you go into the exam, it'll make a massive difference in terms of just making sure you can kind of hit all those criteria effectively. Now, topics in previous years. I went through this last year, and what I've put a little note on here is where each topic has come up in each paper. So I've highlighted the times that a topic has come up. This is Theme 1 first. We'll do Theme 4 in a second in Paper 1. I've also put a little note in there if it came up in Paper 2 or 3. It's really, really rare that something comes up in Paper 2 because obviously Paper 2 is not a Theme 1 section. But I guess the key thing is that sometimes there's a little bit of crossover. So motivation might be a hook in a different question in Paper 2. Or organisational design might have just been like a little bit of a link to a little bit of the labour productivity stuff that you might see in Theme 3. But what you can see really is, look, I'm not going to make predictions. I don't make predictions. They never really work very effectively. If other people if teachers want to make predictions, that's absolutely fine. But it's not something I want to do. But if you look at it, you can start making some assumptions about what comes up quite frequently. So, for example, supply and demand comes up quite frequently. You've seen that on 4 of the 7 papers we've had so far. You've seen that obviously motivations has come up in terms of a pattern. Came up a lot last year, came up 3 times last year. One thing that is quite interesting is that, last year I thought price and income elasticity hadn't come up for a while, which it hadn't come up for 3 years, and then both of them came up. Leadership's one that I think, it might not come up on Paper 1, it could be on Paper 3, but we haven't really seen very much leadership, and so it wouldn't shock me to see any leadership in there as well. Little bit of business objectives hasn't been assessed for a while. But then again, I do stress I don't like to make predictions, but it is useful to kind of have a look, and you can get a bit of an idea about what comes up and what frequently comes up when. The same for theme 4. You can see certain things come up quite frequently. So international trade and business growth comes up all the time. But then it's quite a general topic that covers a lot of different bases. We've seen a little bit of protectionism and trading blocks in the last couple of years, but it doesn't come up every year. Conditions that prompt trade doesn't come up, but it does. It's just that 421 is kind of an introduction to the next bit. So it's come up, but it's come up a little bit later on. So you can get a bit of an idea about what's come up and what hasn't come up very much over the years. Marketing in niche markets, like global niche markets, hasn't come up came up last year. Cultural and social issues like cultural differences between countries hasn't come up for a while, so maybe you'll see something about that. But again, I think you can get too obsessed with coming up with these predictions, and I don't necessarily think there's enough of a clear pattern to be able to make a judgment from this. But I think it's worth having a look at anyway. Okay. If you've watched the previous Paper 1 preparation video, then the rest of this is probably not going to be anything you've not heard before. I'm going to re-record it because I do think there might be little bits I'll add in, but generally speaking, if you've watched that before, you've probably seen all the new stuff that you need to from this video. If you haven't watched any of those before, I would strongly recommend having a look at this because themes 1 and themes 4 are put together for a reason, and so I want to try and explore some of the key links between those two themes. So we're going to look at a few different sections here. We're going to look at marketing and people management, because that is pretty much themes 1.2, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 is marketing, 1.4 is people management. And we'll do a little bit of ethics as well, not because ethics comes up in theme 1, because it comes up in theme 3 and a bit in theme 4, but because there are some ethics in the way we manage people and the way we market globally. So we're going to have a look at those bits. Okay, market strategy. These are the 3 main marketing strategies. They are mentioned in marketing 4.3.1, and obviously marketing is a theme 1 topic, so you might see a bit of a link here. So you need to know the difference between ethnocentric, polycentric, and geocentric. Ethnocentric is where you believe the approach you have will carry over in any market. Often the case in UK businesses for companies that maybe have brands that are British, like Burberry, for example. There's no need to change that because what you're selling abroad is that particular product with that particular brand identity. Polycentric is where you actually just adapt your marketing approach for every single market. This is going to be the case where maybe your product has less differentiation, maybe less of a unique selling point, so you need to adapt in order to be competitive. And then geocentric is the mixed approach that businesses try to take advantage of. You try and take advantage of whatever you can transfer, but you do make little adjustments where need be. So for example, Apple have made slight adjustments to their products in different countries, although try to avoid it as much as possible because it obviously increases production costs. Coca-Cola, which are going to be mentioned again a little bit later, they do this quite effectively by changing the size of the packaging because different countries consume fizzy drinks in different quantities. Now, entering new global markets, I've touched on this one already, but when you enter a new global market, you have to make different decisions about the product, price, place, and promotions of the market mix. Now, this could be the stuff that you change when it comes to your geocentric approach. So, for example, product, you might have to make different amendments to your product to suit different countries' tastes and requirements. You might have to change the price. Obviously, you're going to have to change the price because of income levels being different in different countries. You can't charge £2 in certain countries or the equivalent of £2 because in some countries that could be like a daily wage. The place, like the way that transportation and distribution happens in different countries needs to be acknowledged. How easy is it to transport goods? How good is the infrastructure? As well as like what is the online access like if it's an e-commerce based business. And then promotion, it must be suitable for different audiences, especially when you're taking into consideration the fact that people have different beliefs in different countries, different religious observances, and so something could be quite offensive in other cultures to what is intended, and there's plenty of business examples that have made that mistake. In terms of differences, there are also big differences between different countries in terms of tastes, trends, and cultures, and this can make businesses have to adapt their products quite significantly when you're thinking about your market mix. Now, when you think about a highly differentiated product, like the Apple products, typically they have to do less of this because the power of the brand means that consumers want that business, want that product. But for a maybe less differentiated business, they might have to make significant adjustments, or if there are just really significant differences in tastes, trends, and cultures in those different countries. People management is also a big factor. So think about labour markets globally, skill shortages, wage rates being different, different levels of education and literacy standards and the Human Development Index. So thinking about how recruitment looks in different countries, there could be a trade-off between wanting high standards, but also wanting low wages. And so a lot of businesses make the decisions to set up as a production facility or in different in different countries because of different factors local to that area. So, for example, wage rates or accessibility of infrastructure. So there's a few things that need to be taken into consideration when we think about people management, and that does link to the ethics, which we'll touch on in a second. In terms of recruitment and selection, that's also important because there are differences in terms of legal procedures and requirements. And so what we've seen quite a lot is offshoring and outsourcing. So just to go through those two definitions quickly. Outsourcing is where you pay another company to do the work for you. So you don't do it yourself, you pay them to do it for you. Offshoring is where you still do it, but you pay, but you move the operations abroad. Now, this can have a huge impact on customer service, but it also can have a huge impact on profit levels, because if you can do that level of customer service or manufacturing in a different country and save a significant amount of money, that can have a huge impact on your competitiveness in the market, especially if it allows you to reduce your prices or set your prices at like a market level. BT are a really good example of a business that outsourced and offshored a lot of their customer services, and got a bit of criticism from it because it impacted on the level of customer service that was provided. But there's plenty of businesses, so many businesses that have outsourced their production to different countries that it would be impossible to name them all. Although there will be an example of one coming up a little bit later on. So when we think about the ethics, we've got to take into consideration the differences between different countries and the cultural differences. So again, this hasn't come up for a little while, so you might see something exemplified with this, but it depends on what the market is. But people in different countries have different attitudes towards things like alcohol, towards animals, towards style of dress. And so in marketing, and especially in promotion, businesses can, if they're not aware of the cultures in that market, potentially upset and offend people. Now, labor practices, this is probably the most significant example of ethics that links to theme 1 in terms of the standards in developing economies. Now, they're getting better, but there are still examples of sweatshops and child labor in these different businesses. Nestle, for example, there's been quite a lot of criticism about Nestle in terms of child labor in some of the farms that are used in their supply chain in Africa. And this trade-off between profit and fair treatment of workers contributes to this quite significantly. Now, again, this is a paper 1 video, so not a paper 3 video, but paper 3 is all about the clothing market. And so maybe it's more likely you see something about this there because it seems like quite an obvious one, the ethics of the global labor market when it comes to clothing. But Primark's a really good example of where they have taken advantage of cheaper production and cheaper labor rates in different countries, and it's had an impact on their reputation. But consumers still go there because you can fill a bag with 45 t-shirts and 3 pairs of trousers for a tenner and get really, really good value for money. So the thinking about what makes this fair it's a bit of a subjective one, because obviously if they are meeting the legislation requirements of that country, then you could argue that they're not breaking the law, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the ethical thing to do, and especially if their working conditions are worse than they would be in a more developed economy with more legal structure. So there's a few things to think about there. There's a few things to think about there in terms of the links between themes 1 and 4. If you've got any questions about paper 1 specifically, chuck them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them before the exam. If I don't speak to you before then, I wish you the best of luck. And I'll see you for the paper 2 video, which might actually release just a little bit before paper 1 launches, because I want to try and get it out a week in advance and there's only a week between the two. But if not, it'll come out maybe the day after paper 1. All right, good luck. If you've got any questions, let me know. Have a look at the links in the description for a little bit more help as you get ready for the small matter of some A-level exams.